Thanks for coming out. I don't need to reintroduce the panel. I remember when I was being asked what panel I wanted to do, and I remember how often there were panels on debut novels. And not to take anything away from debut novels, but I'm just kind of sick and tired of talking about debut novels. And I'm like, I look at people and go, you have no idea what life you have ahead of you. And so on. But nobody talks, and I was like, nobody really talks about second novels. It's like, it's like, oh, nobody talks about second albums and so on. And I think there's so many things. I know we were going to talk about it, but there's so much about a second novel. Most of what I learned about writing a second novel, I had to learn the hard way. Yeah? And I think we're going to start with that. There's somebody to brief us through this briefly, your process of writing that novel.
Sure.
In 10 words or less.
Let's see. I came up with the idea on a train ride after running into my friend, the late David Rakoff, who had told me a story about an opera singer who P.T. Barnum had, sent on a farewell tour around the United States. And the sort of upshot of the train ride home was just me fantasizing about this opera singer that I imagined was in a circus, which was not true. And that's where the idea started, but it took so many years after that to sort of crawl out of the well of the dream that was born on that train ride.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that's the shortest version of the Queen of the Night. And when I say so many years, it was like I first had that idea in the late 90s, and then put it aside until 2005, and then sold it with a contract that was hilariously dated to 2006. And then finished the novel the first time and was going into production in 2013, pulled it, and then it finally came out in 2016. So, horrifying.
I have the horrifying follow-up questions, don't worry.
I think I have the same time spread. So the first novel was based on my experiences in my first year of college, and I started writing it in my 20s, like around 2000. And I had taken a year off from grad school, and I really tried, and then I couldn't finish it. And then 9/11 happened, which is how I remember what time it was. And then I went back to school because I broke my arm and I didn't have health insurance. And then I got this great insurance from doing a PhD in Russian literature. And then I didn't. Then I ended up editing. Then I became a nonfiction writer, but I always really wanted to write novels. And then I had a contract to write a book that I couldn't write. But then I was like, wait, didn't I already do this? And so then I got that book from the cloud, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to fix this one. So then that became my first novel. So by the time it came out, it was 2017. So it's a book about based on my experiences of being 18 in the 1990s, and it came out in 2017, which is the year I turned 40, like a month into the Trump presidency. And I was doing all these interviews with people who were like, so what's the political, and I kind of realized doing the promotion and the circus around that book that it was actually a book about depoliticization and also heteronormativity, go figure. I didn't realize that at the time, and then I realized, I actually didn't make this, this book wasn't clear even to me, so let alone to other people. So I was like, I have to actually go back to that time and write another book, because then I was like, it's 2017 and I'm 40 and I'm a lesbian and I'm living my best life, and I was like, why didn't I do this sooner? And also, how is the world such a mess? And then so I I had to go back in time and figure out because you can't remember when you don't have the vocabulary. Why did I not think that rape culture was a word, or patriarchy was a word I was going to use? Why didn't I think that queer theory was something that applied to me. So I had to sort of like go back. So it was kind of a bummer for me to be like, because I was excited to write a novel about something else, and it felt like when people were like, "Oh, what's your new novel about?" I was like, "It's her second year of college." And but yeah.
So I never wanted to be a novelist. My whole life as a kind of adult person, once I found literature, I wanted to be a poet. And I studied poetry, and for 20 years I was like a priest of poetry. I thought being a poet, devoting one's life to poet was the noblest thing one could do, which I still believe. And it felt like I feel this deep shame about the fact that I started writing novels. And that happened because it feels very degrading somehow to write novels. It happened because I was a high school teacher, and I took a job sort of because I needed to blow up my life somehow. I took a job in Bulgaria, and something about going to this place, like I think before I knew about the job, I don't think I could have found Bulgaria on the map. Like there was no deep connection. It was really sort of a leap into the abyss. And something about being in that place and falling in love with that place made me start writing fiction, made me start writing prose. And, I wrote actually really both of my books, I wrote them with like kind of tricking myself into not ever thinking that I was writing a book. Like if I had thought, oh, I'm going to write a novel, I would never have written a line. Instead, I just thought I'm writing sentences. And like the book kind of formed out of that very organically.
Is that the kind of trick that only works once? I'm like asking for a friend.
Well, but I kind of got like buy one, get one free. Because like one of the things that I came to understand about my first novel, which is about a very obsessive, claustrophobic sort of love relationship, I understood that what I was writing needed to be as obsessively focused as the protagonist is on this man that he's in love with. And yet there was all of this other stuff I wanted to write. And, I came to understand that there was going to be another container for sort of the overflow. And, I would finish a section, my first novel, What Belongs to You, is in 3 sections. And at the end of each of the first 2 sections, I needed it to breathe for a little bit. And I wrote a piece without thinking it was going to be a book, but I wrote like a scene. I wrote like a piece of what would then become Cleanness. And so the 2 books sort of, they're very distinct as books to me. One's not a sequel or a prequel of the other. But in some way, they were sort of one project. And I feel really lucky about that because I didn't have the anxiety of oh shit, I have to do this again. It was already existed, kind of.
How nice for you.
Buy one, get one free. I'm a big fan.
Khaled.
Yeah, I mean, I had not a similar experience, but kind of in the same way. The idea for the second novel was kind of born as I was really finishing up the first one. My first novel was really set in a world of men. It was kind of a love triangle between these 3 male characters, a father and these 2 boys. And there was a part of me as I was finishing this book that sort of realized that there's this paucity of really sort of substantial female characters in this book. And I ended up going on what turned out to be a very transformative journey to Afghanistan in March of 2003, about 3 months before the Cleanness was published. And I spent about a little over 2 weeks in Kabul. I went as a 38-year-old father of 2, and I had left as an 11-year-old boy. So I revisited a city that was dramatically transformed by cycles of war. The city was essentially demolished. Many sections of it were. I ended up talking to a lot of people, and people I found incredibly generous with their stories, and it's particularly women. I ended up talking to a lot of women about what life was like for them under the Russians, during the horrible civil war that predated the Taliban takeover in 1996. And the stories were just incredibly riveting and horrific and appalling and inspiring. And I came away from that saying, well, I've had this book coming out in 3 months, but I have no idea anybody's going to read it. But I know that I'm going to write a second book, and it's going to be about the story of women in Afghanistan. I just found it so riveting. I just found it so, it connected with me so deeply personally that I knew I was going to write about that no matter if anybody read it or not.
Oh, wow. I wrote my second novel because if I didn't, I wouldn't graduate. And it's probably the second fastest novel I've ever written. And I remember going through trying to figure out what the hell am I going to write next. And I remember once I saw this story about the Louvin brothers, and I was going to write this Jamaican version of these twin albino, oversexed gospel singers roaming through the country. And the name of it was Cock and Bull. And I wrote 300 pages of this thing. And then I called, who did I call? I think it was another writer. I said, if I'm 300 pages in a book and I hate all the characters, should I keep writing it? And he's like, step away from the laptop. And the Book of Night Woman happened because I started writing a novel that was set in 1834. The protagonist was a British commander, and it was a totally different kind of story. And I wrote one chapter where there was this woman serving in a room, in a bar, and somebody said, that woman, she has secrets. And if there's one thing I like more than anything else, it's to eavesdrop on people's secrets. And I was like, what is the story there? And that woman completely overtook the novel. To the point where I was actually complaining to the professor. I'm like, she stole my book. It's like, and I mean, the whole time, like, yeah, and I'm like, yeah, I'm going to keep doing this, but that's not the novel. This thing over here is the novel. And I was like, this woman stole my book. And that's how Book of Night Woman happened. Just somebody. And since then, I've realized almost every book I've written comes out of a book that failed. And I was like, I wish I had a cleaner process of writing books. No, I just write shit until something sticks. Like, you know?
Another way of writing quickly is to get paid first, which is what happened to me. My second novel, I was on the contract, and I had already been partly paid for signing. Yeah. So I knew I had to deliver something. It was either get busy writing or get busy paying back money you've already spent.
So, I don't know. Vikram Seth didn't take that advice. Sorry, Vikram, if you're here.
I don't advise
Neither
it.
did I.
That didn't work for me.
The inevitable process question is going to come, so I'm going to ask it before everybody. I'm curious about is there any aspect of writing your first novel you realize could not work for writing your second? Because the first mistake I made with writing my second novel was trying to write it like I wrote the first one, and that failed. They're all so stumped.
No, were you? I didn't realize. I don't know. I think it's just such a different process. The writing a first book. We were talking about that earlier in the green room. Is like I was saying to Elif, I wish I could just capture that feeling and put it in a bottle and just carry it with me everywhere, because you can never duplicate that. Because your audience is entirely theoretical. I mean, you're really writing just with the expectations nobody's going to read this thing. And once you publish, and especially if your first book does well, it's okay, now there is an audience, and there are anticipations, there are expectations, and so I think the challenge really becomes about how to put on blinders and how to shut out the noise, because it's very easy for the world to intrude in and have its say on something that really ought to be a private relationship between you and the manuscript. So for me, the thing that I did not do with the first book, which I really had to learn how to do with the second book, was to sort of climb down into this mental bunker and put the blinders on, and I just realized that I cannot be tainted by agendas that aren't my own and therefore don't serve me very well. And so I approach writing really from a much more intentional stance and a much more conscious awareness of the perils of outside influence.
I mean, I felt that very strongly. I mean, I was so unprepared when I published my first book. I mean, I don't think anybody thought anyone would read it. I mean, the marketing budget for it was exactly $0. And it's a book about a guy who exactly, FSG. They're like, we believe in free publicity, like the review. And bless them, I love them. I'm so happy to publish with them. I am, actually. But, like just after 20 years of working really hard as a writer in complete obscurity, and then publishing this book that is about like a guy who goes to Bulgaria and pays a guy for sex and gets syphilis. Like, who's going to read that? Like nobody. And then
Sounds like a bestseller.
And then like, so when it did get attention, I mean, I went in with this idea of I'm going to say yes to everything. Like, I'm so excited that anybody wants me to do anything. And I lost 2 years. Like, I lost 2 years of my life as a writer, or the real life of a writer, which is, I mean, to me, like, certainly writing my first book, I mean, it was the most intense experience of privacy I've ever had. I mean, I was living in Bulgaria. I was writing in a language that wasn't the language of the place I was living. I was living in this, sort of Soviet-era apartment block in Mladost. I was teaching full-time as a high school teacher, so I woke up at 4:30 every morning to write for 2 hours. Like, it was still dark. I was at my kitchen table with my notebook. Like, what is more private than that? And that is so, like, I find the experience of writing, of like trying to make art, just like absolutely uninterrupted humiliation and failure. And like the privacy is so necessary. Like, I so desperately need to feel really like no one ever needs to see this. And it took me a long time to get back to that place. And my approach then, like after publishing my second book and then now heading into publishing my third book, like I just feel so desperately protective of that space and of sort of not being willing to throw away years, sort of having this public life as a writer, which to me is exactly the opposite of the real life of a writer, which is sitting with your notebook, all alone.
Yeah, everything that both of you have said is so resonant and painful. I remember, so when I edited The Idiot, I kind of had two first books because my first published book was a nonfiction book, but it was a memoir, and The Idiot is kind of autobiographical novel, so they're kind of close, and I just can't get out of here. And when I went back and I looked at the first draft of The Idiot that I'd written in my 20s, a little bit like with the first draft of my nonfiction book, which it was about the pursuit of Russian literature and involved a lot of kind of like colorful characters, none of whom I ever dreamed would read the book, and then of course they all did, and I got a lot of emails, and you can't call these people. So I wrote a thing about an ice palace where these Empress Anna Yanovna tortured two of her jesters by making them spend the night in the palace in the middle of the winter in Petersburg. And then I wrote that, and then I got an email. No, it wasn't an email. It was on like monogrammed paper from Chicago that was like a descendant of the jester who was like, you can't call these people jesters. They were professional entertainers. And this was like, so I was just like, everyone could read it. And then when I went and I looked back at the first draft of The Idiot, the thing that, like, it was so clear that the person who wrote that not only thought that nobody was going to read anything, but also felt the sense of, like, this kind of outrage at everything, and, like, why doesn't anyone listen to me when I have lots of good ideas? and that's such a fun position to be writing from when you feel like nobody's listened to you yet, and you have all these things to say, and you have all these pointers, and then by now, it's like, once you're a person who has some kind, like, I just feel guilty all the time for all the people who like listen to me and pay attention to me that I feel like I don't deserve. And it was like so much more fun feeling like I deserved more attention than I got than feeling like I deserve less attention than I get. And it dampens your sense of like hilarity and just like riotousness. And then when your books start getting assigned, I don't know, like I had this girl from Brown interviewed me for the student paper, and she was from a freshman class that everyone had to read The Idiot, which was not repeated again. I think it did not really go very well. And she's like, I was from that class. And then I was like, oh, great. And she's like, I know that you've talked about like how uncomfortable you felt about your book being assigned. And I was like, well, yeah, because the book is about someone who feels so put upon by all of culture that's being foisted on her. And then, 2 minutes pass. It's like you don't even get time to breathe. Like 2 minutes go by and like you're being being foisted down other people's throats. And she's like, it's so funny that you say that because, of course, like, you know, we had to go break up in small groups and everyone had to write 500 words on this chapter on the idiot. And everyone's like, this girl is so annoying. I was like, yep, it's been a pleasure.
I think, in terms of this idea of like, what did I do for the first novel that I could not do for the second novel, I think I did realize, so first of all, I decided it was going to be historical fiction, that this would be set in the 19th century in France, and I didn't speak French, but it turns out neither did my main character, so that was sort of, sometimes people were like, so what part of this is autobiographical? And I was like, really? But not knowing French. Yeah, and I had this very funny moment with the writer Edmund White, because I knew that if you were writing about opera singers in the 19th century, you would probably also be writing about courtesans. And I had mentioned that to somebody, and they said, oh, well, if you're writing about courtesans, then you have to go talk to Edmund White. So I was like, all right. And I actually knew Edmund White, so I called him up and had one of the best conversations I've ever had. But what was funny to me is that I knew that already that the title would be The Queen of the Night. And he asked me, like, well, what are you going to call it? And I told him, and he said something I've never forgotten. He said, oh, is it about that male brothel in Rome where all the priests go? And I was like, no. And then I thought, can I write another novel called The Queen of the Night? About that afterwards? But the thing that I did do a lot of research for my first novel, which was autobiographical in certain ways. But the scale of the research that I had to do for this was on such a different level. And I remember at one point I had like 60 books out from different libraries. And I was sort of moving between them, and it felt like something that had neither the pleasures of fiction nor of writing a biography, but the responsibilities of both. And so there were times when I would read like all of these different resources just to like write a garden party scene, and then I would read a few paragraphs of something else like the next day, and I'd be like, oh, couldn't happen, you know, like, and so then I would have to sort of, and I was doing this thing where it wasn't really historical fiction either, it was more what I would call fake history, or where I was inserting a character into a real history as if she had existed alongside all of these famous people, and it was written the way that famous women at the time wrote their autobiographies, which is to say that part of how they would tell you that they were famous is that they would tell you stories about famous people. And so almost nothing that I learned writing my first novel really applied in the writing of the second novel. And I think the biggest lesson of it all, too, was that a lot of my original instincts were actually dead on. Like, after all of those years, when I was like having a horrific time with the structure, when I finally settled on the thing that I thought was too tacky, basically. And this is where Garth and I have had conversations about the need to be in bad taste as a writer, or at least to risk it. But that very tacky solution was the thing that fixed it. So, or that I feared was tacky.
Oh. Yeah, my second novel was a historical novel as well. It's set over 200 years before the first one. And I remember at the first or the second draft, I was really proud of how the tone was Everybody's Afraid of Napoleon. And I thought, I'm writing this novel set in a Jamaican slave plantation. I know my shit. And then my editor goes, Napoleon wasn't Napoleon yet. And I actually said, but you know it's a novel? It's like, no, you can't. Napoleon didn't even exist yet. So I had to rewrite so much of that blasted book. And I missed how comparatively easy it was writing the first novel. I just wrote this sort of imagined thing. But then to write something that was, not it's playing by the rules of history, if not necessarily 100% accurate. It was a completely different way of writing. For me as well, that second novel I wrote in Jamaican patois and Jamaican dialect. And if you're Jamaican, if you're Jamaican, you're Nigerian, you're so, and you have a very complicated relationship with the voice that comes out of your own mouth. Because you've been taught it was inferior and that it was broken English. And people still say broken English as if it needs to be fixed. And that was a struggle. I mean, I fought that narrator every step of the way. I was like, all right, let's do this, and I'm going to write the real literature tomorrow. And just to unlearn that whole idea about my own language, it was something which I didn't have to worry about with the first book. So this is for anybody. This is the second novel that you published actually the second novel you wrote? Yeah?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No, I've written several. Disasters, all disasters.
Yeah.
I found one last year that I forgot that I'd written in the 90s when I was going through my files. I recently have said in my writing process is that I write things and then I abandon them, and if they survive the process, then I finish them. Yes, that was something I wrote near the end of graduate school and blocked out, just completely blocked it out.
Is it tempting to go back to it? Is it tempting to go back to it at all?
Oh, I am almost certainly going to finish it. Yeah. But the way in was so funny to me because when I published my essay collection, 6 of the essays in that collection came out of my files. So my agent was like, "What the hell is in your files?" And I remember I'd written these stories, and I said, "Oh, I have like a short story collection." And she was like, "You wrote a whole story collection, and I'm your agent for 20 years, and I don't know." And I said, "Oh, I thought it was juvenilia." She said, "Were you a child when you wrote it?"
Sounds like a good agent.
So, yeah, I was looking back at the stories, and I thought, those stories should probably be a novel. And then I went a little bit further into the files, and I was like, oh, I have had this idea before.
I didn't have novels, but there are books of poems. Like, I have a graveyard of books of poems. So that was sort of I guess kind of my education and like how to do things with words was in poetry.
I remember, I think the worst one, I have so many, the worst one was about a kid reading Moby Dick and not understanding it, and the book was called The Great Whale.
That sounds hilarious.
Oh my God. And of course, Cock and Bull, which every now and then I think, you know what, maybe it's just like a funny phantasmagoric fantasia. Nah, it sucks. It's pretty bad. I think I'll touch. So, for each of you, what was we touched on that before, but what exactly was your second novel pressure? Because I think it's different. For example, if your debut was a big success, there's that kind of pressure. If your debut was not, there's a different kind of pressure. If you're still emotionally in the same space or not, everything brings a different kind of pressure. I'm curious about that.
There's like kind of 2 kinds of pressures. One is the one you alluded to. There's sort of this external thing where there's at least this perception that there's the pressure to live up to the expectations of your readers, your publishers, your agents, the press, your family, your friends, and so forth. And the better your first book does, the more that pressure is amped up. But I found that I think there are ways of managing that. But I found the more sort of insidious and more difficult to manage pressure was the internal one, the one you really just kind of put on yourself. Right. So there's this inner voice that whispers in your ear that says things like, "You're a hack, bro, and I know it. I know you know it, and then the world's about to find out. Good on you to pull the wool over the people's eyes the first time. Yeah. Good luck this time."
Who is that asshole, and like where does he come from? I have that. I have him too.
But the asshole has his role because it's true. Like I found out that the key is not to to silence the voice of the asshole, but rather to understand that if managed properly, he actually brings value. Mm-hmm. Because I have found that every time I write with this kind of unabashed confidence, mm-hmm. it usually ends with me losing my bearings and like face planting. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's not about silencing the voice, but rather really just kind of controlling the spigot and mm-hmm. allowing that voice control time at mm-hmm. the mic. To just kind of allowing it to check me against hubris mm-hmm. and ground me, and allowing that voice to be like a more of a propulsive force mm-hmm. Rather than this drag on your momentum that drains your faith in yourself and your belief in the work. So that was like something that I really learned how to do sort of de novo organically writing the second book, was to really just kind of manage those. But I think it's not just true for the second book. I think it's true for every single time. I was watching this interview with Quentin Tarantino, and he was saying, like, every time he starts a new movie, it's like he's back to square one. It's like he brings none of the wisdom that he learned from his previous films to the making of the new. He has the same fears of failure, the same anxieties every time, because every project is different, and so he has to really just kind of reinvent it all over again. And I found that to be fairly true.
I absolutely hate that. Because I only remember finishing books and how great that feels. So every time I start a book, I'm like, I'm going through this shit again. And I always forget how hard it is to write a flipping book. And so
I mean, I really do feel that, like, I got this buy one, get one free, like, deal with the first two books. And it's actually this third book that I've just finished where really that's the first time where I was like, I'm going to write a book. Like, I'm going to write a novel. And the first two books were...
Third book's over the next panel next year.
See, I'm still cheating. But like, in the first two books, they live in the same world, which was a world that I really love and a place I was very excited about. And they're both like American Abroad, which is its own thing that sort of gives you a whole sort of equipment to use in a novel. And then this third book is like, it's one piece. It takes place in like 8 days instead of several years. And it's set in Iowa, which is a place where I lived for 10 years. And a place that I realized I had an awful lot of kind of cultural, I'm from the Midwest, and therefore I have a lot of cultural baggage about the Midwest. And it was really hard to see this place as, a place accommodating of literature. And so I have really felt, I think it's true, like actually, and not just with each book, but for me with each piece of each of my books. I hate the whole idea of craft, the whole metaphor of craft, because craft suggests that there are like these portable tools that you can kind of carry from project to project. And I just think that's bunk, I think, like each project, like what craft is a solution that one only invents in the face of a problem that is particular to one work. And so, you don't know how to write a book. And every artist in every medium I know feels this way, that you have to sort of invent from wholesale, how do you make a sentence, how do you make a world with every project.
True. I guess I had sort of a similar experience in that my first two books, the memoir, which was actually interconnected essays, some of which had already been published. And that book was not my idea. It was an editor's idea that I should tie these together. And he was, you need to write an introduction, you need to and he was very kind of clear about it. And it was my first book, and I was like, okay. And so that was my first book. And then with my first novel, it was this book that I'd written so many years ago, and I actually had a contract to write another book that had I had not been able to. I wrote a lot of and could not make it work, and there was something about like resuscitating this old book and kind of cobbling it together that made me feel like the third book was the first one, because it was the one that I'm working on. My second novel, which was the third book. And it was like the first time that I was like, I had an idea for a book and I'm going to write it down. Yeah, and then that was a very different process.
It's terrifying.
It's
like
horrible.
to think
It's the
I'm going to
worst.
write a book. Like, who does that? As opposed to like, I'm going to sit and write a sentence, or like, oh, I have an idea for a scene that I'll write, But like to be like, I'm going to write a novel? It's just insanity.
I guess it's all about. I think that it's very true about not silencing that horrible person, about. I don't know. Sometimes I listen to podcasts where like really enlightened people say enlightened things, and I remember one where it was like the negative voices in your head and all the different voices. You're supposed to imagine that you're at a big board table and everyone's kind of giving their feedback and like, but you're at the head of it, and so like just that person doesn't have the So I look forward to implementing that.
I already can't even remember what that is. The pressures I felt for my second book were interesting to me in a number of different ways, I guess, where I do remember, so initially, The Queen of the Night, which became the second novel, the sort of first iteration of it was several paragraphs that I wrote when my first novel was going out on submission, Edinburgh. And the thing that kept happening then during the 2 years which followed, where the first novel did not sell after coming very close a number of times, was that editors kept saying to my agent, "Can you write the second one first?" Which made me hate it. Like where I was like, fuck you, fuck this. It reminded me, I'll stop swearing, but it reminded me of like, of a story my mom had told me about when she had accompanied a friend of hers to an airline stewardess, this was the 60s, audition, and they wanted my mom and not her friend that she'd gone with. And I was like, if you want the pretty sister, you're going to have to take the weird queer one first. Also, there was no guarantee that the second one was going to turn into whatever they thought it was going to be in those marketing meetings. So when I eventually sold the first novel, went on one of those like several years journeys where I said yes to everyone who wanted me to read, and felt incredibly burned out. And I do remember meeting Danzy Senna during that period, where she said something that I thought about a lot, even though I didn't take the advice right away, which was, don't be so busy being an author that you forget to be a writer.
I'm curious if, like, is there anyone who, because I also feel like I did the same thing because I felt so, like, I felt guilty toward the publishers and that I had to go and say yes to everything, and years of your life go by. I'm curious if anyone, like, have you met anyone, or is anyone here one of those people who, like, went in the opposite direction and did very few events and just got to work writing? And is there a downside to that? Because we're like, oh, like maybe things would have been much worse if we hadn't done that.
Yeah. Is that one of our publishers?
That was a publicist for sure.
In any case, the I was really burned out. People were asking me, like, what's your next book? What's your next book? And I kept thinking, like, you want me to do this again? And so I started blogging because it felt really low stakes in that way that was a mistake. Where you're like, I'm just in my home. I'm not online. But you're online. And no one can see this. Everyone can see this. And I do remember my friend Maud Newton, who I mentioned earlier when we were talking backstage. She and I talked about how we felt like our blogs that we had written had become, in a weird way, like a book of their own that was a sort of like mediocre second book that, didn't hurt us in some way, which of course is lies. I think the blog, I don't think the blog was a bad thing, I should say, but I could have written another book. And I guess the pressure I kept feeling was like that I was going to defy in some way a role that I had not wanted, which was, in 2008, these Asian American studies scholars at the MLA took me out for drinks, and they were like, "You're the first Korean American gay author." And I was like, really? Because I had thought that, but, and they're like, "Yeah, we checked." And then I felt like, clearly this French novel is a mistake. And so then I sort of was moving between this feeling of failing the novel, failing an audience that I wasn't even sure I had. And that was kind of that pressure at that time for, I guess, almost a decade.
It's interesting. My first novel came out with an independent press, Akashic Books, and they were wonderful. But I think for probably the closest to what Elif was mentioning, the second novel I wrote almost with no pressure at all. One, because I think nobody's going to buy it anyway, or something. And the mentioned before, my pressures were all sort of creative, like what language am I going to use? Who's going to read a book set, written in slave patois and all of that, and just sort of what exactly is this book supposed to look like, and what should it sound like, and so on, and because I remember reading novels in so-called standard English that are highly vernacular without them identifying the narrator. And I was like, why is it then when it's Black American English or South Asian English is always some first-person narrator? Even the character, the narrator revealing herself at the end of it was not my decision, and I still kind of regret it because I actually wanted it to stay because this is language, and it should stay how it is. I mean, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. Yeah. We were talking backstage about writing space, and where do you write and how do you write, and I'm very curious about that.
I wrote my first novel in my kitchen. I was a practicing physician at the time. I was working full time, so I too got up like at 4:30 in the morning and wrote for 2.5, 3 hours, and then showered up and got dressed, drove to the clinic, saw people with heart failure, and then did the same thing the next day. For a Thousand Splendid Suns, I ended up shifting venues. I rented a very, very small, a glorified bunker, really, with no windows, just a door and 4 walls. And if I were to sort of lie flat and stretch my legs and arms, I'm pretty sure I could have met the 2 walls. And there was this completely useless pillar right down the middle of the room.
Is that like in a co-working facility? Or?
I
think I saw that.
It was in one of those completely ubiquitous sort of high-tech, joints in Northern California. I'm from Silicon Valley, so they all look exactly the same. So there's like tons of office space to rent. And so I got this place, and it was truly a depressing place. But in a way, it was really effective because it was absolutely there's no distraction whatsoever. The Wi-Fi sucked. And so I ended up just walking. I was telling, I think, you guys earlier, I pace a lot when I write. So I probably walked miles and miles and miles in that place every day, just sitting down, writing a few sentences, then pacing around the same four corners like a tiger in a cage. You know, it was just so that was my seminal memory of writing the second novel. And I think if I didn't have that space, I mean, it was sort of a metaphor for the bunker, really. Just so I was referring to the mental bunker, but this is actually a physical bunker, and a really a way of like truly isolate and sort of being in a really insular space.
Find the most miserable space you can think of. That's how you write a second novel.
You know, it's so funny because like now I look back at that time when I was like teaching full time as a high school teacher, waking up at 4:30, and I like romanticize it. I'm like, I was so disciplined. It was so pure. But like it was utterly miserable when I was doing it. And you know, in my first novel, and then the first like 3 pieces, or they're not the first ones in the book, but the first that I wrote of the second book, I wrote at that table in my kitchen / dining room / living room in Bulgaria. And I remember in the early morning dark, and I think about how, you know, there was another block right across the street, and like I memorized the order in which the lights came on and people would step onto their balconies to smoke their first cigarette. And like I felt like I knew them, you know, like we had this bond. My second book, you know, I was like living in a shitty student apartment in Iowa City, and I like wrote in lots of different places, but there was one place in particular that I remember. Like the first thing that I wrote after finishing What Belongs to You, and the first thing I wrote after coming back to America, it was in the summer before classes started at Iowa, and it was what's now the second chapter of Cleanness, which is this very slow Jamesian first-person account of what becomes a sexual assault. And it was utterly terrifying. Like, it was just a really hard, difficult thing to write. And I couldn't write it. Like, I needed to have people around me. And so there's a cafe called High Ground in Iowa City. And there was one table. I would go there like the minute they opened in the morning. And I would sit at that table. And I would write, and I would get so drawn into this incredibly dark space. And I remember how important it was for me to be able to look up from the page and like see other people and be like, okay, like, you know, like I'm
real. I have a face.
Exactly. So I feel very grateful to High Ground in Iowa City.
My first novel, so I was also in Silicon Valley. I was at Stanford, and I took a year off from grad school. And my boyfriend at the time, who had a job designing intelligent radars for the Army, actually, for DARPA. Yeah, it was a wild time. And we somehow qualified for middle income housing between the two of us, because I had like 0. And so I had this like, so I wasn't like getting up at 4. I just had this like, I wrote logical reasoning questions for like the test, not the GRE, but the GMAT, the thing that business school people have to take. And I'm not especially good at logical reasoning. And I just remember sending in, you know, like you send in 10 and they take 3 of them, but you get $400 if they take one. And I just remember getting these letters back that were like, this is not logical and it's not reasoning. But so it was like an apartment on like Webster and Geary, and there was like a recycling center outside that consisted of a man just like hurling glass into a thing full of other glass all day long. And I also remember that as kind of an idyllic time. And then, yeah, it just has this like rosy. And then, but then by the time I was editing it to turn it into a novel, was actually, you know, I was in my late 30s, so I'd accumulated some cultural capital. And I was actually, we were talking about residencies, and I was at the one where you have dinner with the Baronessa, and actually, it was like, so in Tuscany, and she's really into pugs, so there were like a lot of living pugs, and then like an obelisk with the names of all the dead pugs on it. And I don't think I would have been able to like exhume that old novel if I hadn't been somewhere that was so like discontinuous from my personal experience, my knowledge of the human condition, of, you know, world geography, and I went in the cloud and I downloaded it and I started doing it there, and it was great. So that's a positive residency story.
Her husband is also buried.
Yeah, under the pyramid. And on
Yeah,
the
there's
obelisk,
another obelisk, or actually it's a pyramid.
It's a pyramid.
In
and
the woods.
And her parents, she exhumed them and put them there.
Yes.
And then on the obelisk, there's a little dot next to a few of the dogs, and those are the ones that aren't pugs.
Yes. The idea of the discontinuous, though, I think is something that I'm always chasing, because I was thinking about how I felt at many points during the writing of my second novel a bit like someone who was constantly being displaced because I needed to feel like nobody could find me when I was writing. So like if I went to a cafe, if they started to get to know me and the barista would be like, hey, how's it going? I'd be like, oh, it's too bad I have to leave. Find
That's
a new
so
cafe.
real. It's like you're like a criminal. I feel like that too.
And so anytime I could find like a kind of fugitive space, that felt like the best place. But, you know, I guess I started the second novel in the Brooklyn apartment where I wrote most of my first novel. And then moved away to Los Angeles for my early midlife crisis, where I lived in like an enormous apartment in Koreatown with 3 other men, and I wrote part of it there. Then I ran out of money and moved to Maine and wrote part of it in my mom's basement on like my late father's old desk from his office. Then I like sold the novel and made enough money to leave the basement and went to Rochester with my boyfriend at the time, where I was a disgruntled faculty spouse for a year. Then I got to Amherst College, and a colleague gave me for 2 years the use of his library carrel in the Frost Library. And I remember my sister bought me like a spelunking light so that I could, because you get keys to the library for like 24-hour access, so I could be in there at any time, which was amazing. So I would go when it was closed and work on it there. And then that job ended and I moved back to New York with my now husband, Dustin, and our apartment was too small for me to write in, so I started working at the Center for Fiction. And in the old space. And that was where I wrote the bulk of it. Yeah.
Cool. I think we have to open up for questions from the audience. Not comments disguised as questions.
Thank you so much for the panel. It's been so interesting. I have a question specifically for those of you who wrote kind of autobiographical novels, but it probably applies to all of you. How do you get out of the idea that the people that you're writing about are real and like might at some point read it? And also, how do you grapple with not trying to exploit their lives for your personal novel and like your storytelling, but still wanting to like dig into their really interesting stories of the people you know in real life?
I mean, for me personally, that's like the hardest part of writing, and it's the biggest challenge. To what extent, if a book is based, so the way I think of it is I want to recreate my subjective experience, but of course your subjective experience involves all of your interactions with other people. So like I kind of try to like change stuff about the other people, and I've had experiences of not being able to do it and throwing stuff out for that reason. And I've also had experiences of, I feel like I've had all the different experiences. But for me, the thing that makes it somewhat manageable for me has been writing at a great time delay. So it's like something where being like, not lazy exactly, because I was working really hard, but just sort of like incompetent, or I don't know how to put it exactly, but like when it's 20 years later, first of all, everyone's a different person. I also, there were some characters in my first book that were based on real people in a very recognizable way, and I asked them, and they happened to be super cool about it. And the second one too. I don't know exactly what I would have done if they'd been like, no, I'm not comfortable, don't write the book. Like, what would I have done then? But fortunately, it didn't happen. And but yeah, it's horrible. It's a bad feeling. And I guess the way that I think about it is, I think it's part of shame culture. Like the same thing with being in the coffee shop and being like, when you're recognized, you have to leave. I feel like there's so much shame or feeling shame about writing. And I think there's so much shame about actually documenting your experience and potentially writing. I mean, I think I have a psychoanalytic approach to this now, and I think it's all about feeling guilty about saying bad stuff about your parents. But whatever it is, it's like, we don't air our dirty laundry. Like it's there's an impropriety around telling too much and writing too much. I basically feel like that's a force that I want to combat. Like, there are definitely things in my life that I've done where if someone wrote about it in a book, I think I would feel ashamed, but I don't think I should feel ashamed. You know what? Like, I would like to live in a culture where, like, that shame didn't attach to things that literally everyone does. And so I feel like that kind of helps me go through it. But maybe that makes me a horrible person. You be the judge.
I mean, I think it's really important to acknowledge that innocence doesn't exist, and that art making is never going to be innocent. One is never going to get it exactly right. Representing anybody, anything, is viewed in a certain way, an act of power exerted. I don't think anyone can give you a formula that will tell you what is okay and what isn't. I think every writer has to feel that out for themselves and with the people they love or the people to whom they feel responsible. I also feel very protective of a writer's right to be ruthless.
That sentence didn't go where I thought it was going to go.
Full of surprises. I mean, my feeling of art making is that it comes from a place of kind of undeniable necessity. And I feel like I fail a ruthlessness to which I aspire. But I feel protective of artists who live up to that ruthlessness. And I think we're sort of very uncomfortable, maybe especially in North American literary culture, with the fact that all of us are neck deep in the shit all of the time, and that like none of us is going to be clean or pure or innocent. And just to have that acknowledgement be your starting point, and then to feel it out from there, and to
be able to talk about it, because we're all in it.
And to not try, like, I feel so strongly that nobody gets to tell another artist what they can or can't do. And, to never think that whatever accommodations you make that work in your life are applicable to somebody else's life, or that theirs are applicable to you. Like no one on this panel can tell you how to get it right, But also to accept from the beginning that you probably won't.
Other questions? There's a light right in my face, so I can't see. Oh, somebody in front here? Oh.
Thank you. I was wondering if you, as a writer, so I'm not a writer, just a reader, do you have a favorite book of yours that you've written, or is it sort of like having a favorite child where you say, no, I absolutely don't have a favorite, but deep down you do have a favorite one of the books that you've written?
All of my favorites are unwritten.
Yeah, the next one is my favorite. Yeah.
Your last one's always your favorite, but it's like you love them for their specific qualities. I think it's for me. I love my books. I think largely because they remind me of who I was at the time that I wrote them. I love my first book because I came at writing a complete neophyte. I never studied writing. I never took a writing course. Everything I know about writing is self-taught. So I'm very fond of the Kite Runner for all of its, and I did a annotation of the book a number of years ago for this charity auction, and I had to actually sit after a very, very long time, actually reread it, and I was struck by how much of it worked and how much of it moved me, both because of the story, but also because I remember specifically where I was when I wrote that sentence, and I remember how that sentence really connected with me. But also, there were so many moments where I was like, "Oh my God, what was I doing?" Would take a red pen and would just kind of make all these marks in the margin. So, the second book I really loved because it told a story that I felt so. I felt like with the second book there was a real sense of mission for me. It really was. With none of my other books I've done that, but with the second book I was very much focused on telling a story that I felt like should be shared, because the story of what had transpired with women in Afghanistan had never been told in fiction, and I had this platform to do it, and I felt kind of a sense of mission to do it, and I felt like a real passion to do it. So I'm very fond of it for that reason. And the third book, and this was sort of mentioned on the panel before, is the one where I actually sat and I said, okay, well now I have to write a book, because in a way, the birth of the first book kind of gave way to the second book. So it almost felt like the second book was kind of preordained. I was going to do it. The third book was kind of like creating something de novo, just really out of nothing, out of the ether. And so to me, in some ways, I'm very fond of that book because it feels to me like a real act of creation. So I love all of them for different reasons. I don't know that I have a favorite.
More questions?
Hi, so this will be our last question.
Better be good.
Hi everyone. Hi Khaled, hi Garth, hi Elif, hi Christopher, hi Marlon. I'm Alexia. So I'm sure you guys have been approached with any of your works, like, shouldn't this be a play? Should this be a musical? Should this be a movie? How do you guys feel about your work being transformed into different mediums, and are you open to it?
I can talk about that a little bit. I think if you are so protected, you should allow your work to be translated into a medium that you actually enjoy yourself. So I'm a bit of a cinephile, and I love the theater. And my first and second book were both made into plays, and the first was made into a film. I think the approach that I took was, especially with the film, was that this is a medium that I enjoy as a fan, but I know very little about the creation of it, about how a film is made, and the best thing to do is for me to just kind of make my peace with it and sort of get out of the way and be on the sidelines, because I didn't want to embarrass myself, because a film, there's all these economic decisions that have to be made. At the end of the day, yes, you are the author, but there's only an extent to which your voice will be heard. At the end of the day, there are voices that are more powerful than yours in the making of a film. But I think you do have to realize that an adaptation is not, like for instance, A Thousand Splendid Suns was made into a play, and the playwright took some really, I think, lovely liberties with the book and restructured the book, and maybe to someone that would feel like a real betrayal or like a real, what are you doing, But I don't think it's about just propping up the story on stage and just kind of like, here it is again. It's really about how does this work function as in a different medium. Like, I'm very interested in another artists' sort of perspective on it and what they would do with this material. So I was kind of fascinated by it, but I realized that there's probably some writers who are so protective of it that is just, they can never reach that comfort level with it. But to me, it was really great. A Thousand Splendid Suns was made into an opera. I attended it in Seattle. It was incredibly moving. I was just in tears with it. It was so beautiful. And I was so grateful to the librettist and to the composer for their take on the story. Now, adaptation isn't for everyone. You do have to realize that it's a bit of a vandalization of your work, but as long as it's an artful and meaningful vandalization.
So my first education in art before poetry was in opera. I was an opera singer. That's sort of what allowed me to escape. I was first generation raised off the tobacco farm in Kentucky, and the choir teacher in my public school heard something in my voice and introduced me to opera, and I went on to conservatory. And, you know, everything I know about narrative, for better and for worse, comes from opera. And when I wrote What Belongs to You, I mean, I think it's written with the tools of opera and with lyric poetry, much more than with the tools of a novelist. And it's now been adapted into an opera. And a bunch of my friends from music school who have gone on to have really remarkable careers in music are performing it. It makes me so happy. I mean, in some ways, it feels more congenial. You know, it's like it's sort of, you know, there are lots of things about the novel that don't make sense, that like make people who expect it to be a novel kind of scratch their heads. And I feel like it all makes sense when it's, you know, in this operatic form. So it just, that made me happy. There's also a film in production, which is, well, in production. I hope it's not in production. But I read the script, and I've never felt so violated. And, I mean, it's disgusting. And, like, everything...
Like super porny, it's, like, sexier.
So it was that. You know, everything that made the book interesting, like the fact that this young Bulgarian man the narrator falls in love with identifies as gay, that he's not, like, straight for pay, he's gay. The fact that there's this opening to a door to a reconciliation with the estranged father in the second part, and the protagonist says no to it. Like, that's so crucial. He wrote a reconciliation scene in the script. So, like, I wrote this, like, scorched earth letter saying, please don't renew this option. If you make this film, I will do everything I can and use every platform I have to make sure that everyone knows that it is a disgusting violation of my book. And they renewed the option. So, but I have been doing that. Like, a friend of mine whose boyfriend works at Netflix sent me a DM and was like, my boyfriend has a What Belongs to You project on his desk. How do you feel about it? And I said, kill it. And they did. And I will keep doing that. So anyway, 2 stories of adaptation.
Yeah, Idiot was optioned by. Did you know the screenwriter? Did you have like a? Did this person raise some red flags or pass some sniff test or whatever you say?
So here's what happened. I did know the director. I knew he made terrible films. My partner and I bought a house, which we had inspected, and were told everything was fine. We don't move in. We think we're going to pull up a carpet and polish the floors, and instead, the guy told us it needed $120,000 of repairs. When the offer came in, I had less money in my bank account than my mortgage payment. And so even though I knew if it got made, it would be a shitty film, I said yes. And my agent said, don't worry, it won't get made. But I had no idea. Like, when I read the script, I really did feel like this is like, it is disgusting to treat someone's work in this way.
Wow. Idiot was optioned by a director who had made a documentary, Sandy Tan, and she made this great documentary called Shirkers, which is on Netflix. And I watched that. Yay, Sandy, yay, Shirkers. And it was really different from the Idiot, but there was some sensibility that was the same. It was about something that was from the 90s. There were just a bunch of resonances that made me think, like, okay, let's do this. And then she wrote the screenplay, and she was like, she wrote the script, or whatever they call it, those technical terms. And she said, everyone loves it. Do you want to read it? If I were you, I wouldn't want to read it, but, you know, whatever you think is fine. And I could just tell from how she talked about it, because I thought, you know, how involved do I want to be? Do I want to, like, and I thought, I don't want to be involved. It's her thing. She's an artist. I trust her. I could kind of tell from how she talks about it, and she's kind of said, you know, like, Yvonne's going to be a bigger deal in the movie than he is in the book, because we have to do that because it's a movie. But, like, I kind of feel like she's, like, more into Yvonne than I am at this point. But so, like, I haven't read it, but I'm optimistic and excited. Fingers crossed.
I'm going to just say a lot of the reason why Edinburgh was passed over versus The Queen of the Night was that everyone imagined that The Queen of the Night would be some fabulous film that would make a lot of money. It's still not been optioned. I do think it would make a fabulous series more than a fabulous film. But Edinburgh is more likely to be option first, the way things are going now. So, anyway. Queer Sister wins again.
I was going to add something, but I really think Queer Sister wins again is how we should end this. And I haven't seen anybody giving me that cutoff sign anywhere. I don't know. I go through this sort of ringer with Hollywood. I knew someone was adapting Black Leopard, Red Wolf, and I knew we weren't going to get far when the first discussions. So do you think we should be PG or R? And I'm like, at one point the word cock was mentioned 350 times in that book. I don't think it's a PG film. And it kind of went through the ring of being chewed up, spat out, and trying to do a TV thing now or so on. Hollywood is Hollywood, and I think sometimes they try to be true to the work. A lot of times you can tell the people involved actually didn't read your work. So I think it's a crapshoot, and I think it just depends on who. If you come across a team you can trust and an agent that you can trust, but it can be, it's certainly a learning experience. I will say that, and I'm going to leave it there because we are out of time. Thank you guys for coming. Thank our panel, Alex, Elif, Garth, Khaled. And thanks for coming.